Hello there, I'm Josephine.
And my name is Richard.
Welcome to the Assize Archive, where we step into the shadows of post-war Britain.
You see, Josie, the problem with the Beast of Birkenshaw label is that it suggests something elemental, something supernatural. It's a convenient mask for a very human, very systematic failure of the Scottish police in the 1950s. People like a monster. They hate a docket of missed opportunities. History has a habit of turning structural incompetence into folklore to make the tragedy more palatable. If we call him a beast, we excuse ourselves for not seeing the man. We pretend he was an unavoidable force of nature, a storm surge or an earthquake, rather than a preventable failure of the state. It allows us to sleep at night, believing such things only happen when the stars misalign, rather than when a desk sergeant misplaces a file, or a detective is too proud to admit he's being played by a petty thief with a grandiose imagination. We prefer a demon to a flawed bureaucracy because you can't prosecute a demon for negligence. We create a myth to avoid looking at the mirror of our own collective oversight. The Beast is a fairy tale for adults who are too afraid to look at the paperwork. We prefer to think evil has claws and fur rather than a polished American accent and a clean-shaven jaw. It's the Scottish Gothic reimagined as a police report. The archives don't lie, but they do redact the embarrassments of the powerful. Look at these maps, Josie. Lanarkshire was a patchwork of jurisdictions: the City of Glasgow Police, the Lanarkshire Constabulary, the Hamilton Borough Force, each one more protective of its borders and its closed cases than the victims within them. They were fiefdoms, Josie. Information didn't flow. It stagnated at the county line like silt in the Clyde. Detectives in Hamilton wouldn't speak to the men in Glasgow because of some perceived slight at a Masonic dinner 3 years prior. Manuel didn't just hide in the shadows, he hid in the jurisdictional gaps.
But he was a monster, Richard. I don't care about the bureaucracy for a second. Look at the actions. There's no other word for a man who commits 8 murders with that level of casual, almost recreational indifference. Smashing into homes in the middle of the night. My grandmother used to talk about how people in Lanarkshire were terrified to even look at their own windows after dark. They used to nail their back doors shut and keep the lights on until dawn, even in the middle of summer. They say the sales of heavy-duty bolts tripled in Uddingston and Birkenshaw that year. The Beast title felt earned because the fear he generated was primal. It was a collective trauma that paralysed an entire county. It wasn't just crime. It was a violation of the domestic sanctuary, the one place in post-war Britain where people finally felt they had built something safe. After years of war, blitzes and rationing, the home was the ultimate prize of the 1950s peace. It was the era of the nuclear family, and he targeted the nucleus with surgical cruelty. To have that shattered by a man in a raincoat. That kind of terror doesn't come from a failure of the state. It comes from a predator who knows exactly where the latch is weak and doesn't care who is on the other side. There's a specific, localized evil in a man who can execute a family in their beds on New Year's Day and then sit in their kitchen and eat their leftovers while their bodies are still warm in the next room. That isn't a filing error, Richard. That's a void in the shape of the man. It's the bogeyman stepping out of the nursery rhyme and into the semi-detached house. It's the death of the post-war dream. It's as if he was punishing them for their newfound comfort, treating their security as a personal affront to his own sense of exclusion. He was the ghost of the slums haunting the new suburbs, a reminder that the dark hadn't gone away. It had just moved to a nicer neighbourhood with better wallpaper.
Terrified, yes. Rightly so. But let's look at the Beast without the tabloid fangs for a moment. Peter Manuel wasn't a shadow. He was a known quantity. He had a criminal record that read like a directory of escalating violence, stretching back to his youth in New York. His parents had moved to the States in the 20s, only to return to Scotland during the Depression, bringing a young, already troubled Peter with them. He was an immigrant, a displaced person, in a sense, who'd been in and out of borstals and prisons since he was 12. He was a creature of two worlds, belonging to neither, caught in the friction between Manhattan bravado and Lanarkshire austerity. By the time he was in his 20s, he was a sexual predator and a housebreaker with a penchant for bizarre, performative behavior. He once broke into a house just to cook himself a meal while the owners slept, a chilling display of comfort in a stranger's sanctuary that predated his murders by years. He was the boy from the Bronx in a grey Glasgow landscape, and he played that part with a terrifying, cinematic vanity. He saw himself as a gangster in a world of grocers. He was obsessed with the image of the big man, the Hollywood tough guy who took what he wanted because the world was too slow to stop him. He even affected a slight transatlantic drawl that set him apart from the local shipyard workers, a linguistic affectation that signaled he was different, modern, and untouchable. He was a man who used the mask of sanity not just to hide, but to taunt. He wasn't some back-alley thug. He was a student of his own myth.
But why did it take so long for them to see the pattern? Even with a record, he was walking the streets for years. Was it just a lack of DNA and CCTV? Or was there something deeper? A blind spot in the Scottish psyche that couldn't conceive of such a person existing in their quiet suburbs? We're talking about a time when people still left their milk bottles out and their front doors on the latch. There's a sense of innocence there that he didn't just exploit, he destroyed it. He took the good neighbour policy and turned it into a weapon. They were looking for a criminal, and he was something else entirely. He was a shift in the wind that no one knew how to read. They were playing checkers by the rules of 19th century policing, and he was burning the board with 20th century sociopathy. He didn't just break into houses. He broke the unspoken trust of an entire generation. He made the night a threat again. He turned every shadow in a back garden into a potential executioner. He proved that the picket fence was just a psychological barrier, not a physical one.
It was the culture of the time. They were looking for a type, the soot-stained local Glasgow razor king with a predictable grudge or a gang affiliation. The razor gangs of the Gorbals were the bogeymen of that era. The police understood their logic: territory, respect, retaliation. Manuel simply didn't fit the mold. With his American accent, a relic of his childhood in Manhattan, his tailored suits, and his cinematic vanity, he looked like a minor film noir actor, not a Lanarkshire thug. He was a product of the American dream gone rancid. He used that cultural disconnect as armor. While the police were scouring the pubs for men with scars and rough tongues, Manuel was walking past them in a clean shirt, smelling of expensive tobacco and looking like a man who was destined for better things. He wasn't just an intruder. He was an alien presence in a landscape that didn't know how to translate his particular brand of narcissism. He was the Americanized criminal, a phenomenon the British police were entirely unequipped to profile. They were looking for Charles Dickens characters, and he was giving them James Cagney. He understood the power of the big man persona in a society that still deferred to well-dressed men with confident voices. He talked his way through the world with a confidence that the local constabulary mistook for innocence, or at the very least, for one of our own, who had simply seen more of the world. He didn't just hide, he performed his way through the investigation. He was a chameleon who realized that the best way to hide a monster is to dress it in a tuxedo and give it a script. He would even stop to offer directions to the very officers searching for him, relishing the thrill of being the secret center of their universe. He wanted to be the smartest person in the room, even if the room was a crime scene. He even wrote to the authorities while he was in prison for other crimes, offering insights into the criminal mind, as if he were an academic peer rather than a patient. He was the arsonist critiquing the fire department's hoses while the embers were still glowing in his pockets. He wanted them to know he was superior, and that need for superiority was his only true vulnerability. He was the master of ceremonies in an investigation that was consistently 3 steps behind him.
So you're saying the police just missed it? His first victim, Anne Nealons, he beat her with an iron bar on a golf course in East Kilbride. The brutality was shocking, yet they didn't link it to the later housebreakings. They thought it was a random act of a madman instead of the first step of a methodical hunter. Then there was Isabel Cook, just 17, who disappeared on her way to a dance at the High Blantyre Miners' Welfare. There were massive searches, thousands of volunteers combing the woods and the banks of the Clyde. Mothers kept their daughters locked in after 6. How do you hide from that? There's a lack of pattern there that's almost more frightening than a calculated killer. It feels chaotic, like a storm that hits different houses for no reason. How does a bureaucracy stop a storm? They were searching for a motive, and his only motive was the thrill of the hunt. They kept looking for a grievance, but he killed for the glory of it. He was a man who wanted to be a legend, and he was willing to stack bodies to reach the height he required. The terror was the point, Richard. He was feeding on the panic. He was the only one in Lanarkshire who wasn't afraid, because he was the reason for the fear.
It felt chaotic to them, because they were obsessed with motive in the traditional sense. In the 50s, people killed for money, for passion, or for revenge. Those were the 3 pillars of the detective's handbook. Why kill the Nealons girl, and then, weeks later, kill a whole family? There was no financial gain that justified the risk. But they didn't just miss it. They were looking the wrong way, because Manuel was a master of the red herring. He had this terrifying, narcissistic intelligence that thrived on proximity to the law. He actually assisted the police in other investigations while he was active. He was a police informer while he was committing the murders, providing tips on low-level housebreakers to build rapport with detectives in Hamilton and Glasgow. He would sit in their offices, drinking their tea, complaining about the crime rate, while the blood from his latest victim was barely dry on his boots. He understood the institutional ego of the police. He knew that if he made himself useful, he made himself invisible. He was the classic hiding in plain sight archetype, a man who would chat with the very officers hunting him, relishing the secret knowledge that he was the apex of their frustration. He even handed over a stolen gun to the police once, claiming he'd found it, just to see if they could link it to his crimes. They couldn't. He was mocking their science, their methods, and their intuition, all while being hailed as a helpful citizen. It was a macabre game of catch me if you can, and the police didn't even know they were playing, until the bodies started piling up too high to ignore. He was essentially a consultant for the very force trying to stop him, a fox helping the hounds find the wrong scent. He relished the dramatic irony of being the man they needed to solve the crimes he was committing. He even suggested suspects, men he had petty grudges against, hoping the police would do his dirty work for him. He was using the state as his personal janitor, cleaning up the human clutter of his life. He was a master of the reverse profile, He knew exactly what they expected to find, so he gave them everything but that.
That's cold. He was playing them like a game, and while he played, people died. I remember reading about the Watt family murders, the mother, Marion, the daughter, Vivian, and the sister, Margaret Brown. That case was a national scandal. Didn't they arrest the husband first? That's the part that always felt like a movie script. The innocent man behind bars while the killer roams free. It's the ultimate nightmare, losing your family and then being accused of their slaughter. It destroyed William Watt's life before he even got a chance to mourn. The press practically hung him before the trial even started. They wanted a domestic villain, not a ghost. It was easier to believe a husband could snap than to believe a stranger could walk through a locked door and slaughter 3 people for no reason. It preserved the myth that we are safe as long as we know our neighbours. It turned a public tragedy into a private scandal, which is always more digestible for the masses.
Precisely. William Watt, a respectable businessman. They held him in Barlinnie prison for 67 days, convinced they had their man because he had a lukewarm alibi and a strained marriage. The police even tried to claim he had driven from a fishing trip in the Highlands, committed the murders, and driven back in an impossible time frame. The ghost car theory was an exercise in pure desperation. To make the math work, Watt would have had to average 80 miles an hour on 1950s Highland roads in the middle of the night. It was a physical impossibility, yet the police clung to it like a life raft. It was easier for the Lanarkshire Constabulary to believe in a domestic tragedy than a random, motiveless intruder. It fit their narrow world view. While Watt was behind bars, Manuel was out there, free, likely laughing at the incompetence. He even met Watt's solicitor, Lawrence Dowdall. He sent letters. He offered information. He even claimed he'd been offered the hit on the family by a mystery figure from the underworld. He was inserting himself into the narrative, Josie. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to be the protagonist of the entire tragedy. He was taunting the system from the inside, essentially acting as a consultant for his own crime. He even took Dowdall to the site of the murders to reenact what he claimed to know, pointing out details that only the killer could have seen, yet he framed it as rumor. The audacity is staggering. He wasn't just escaping justice, he was performing for it. He wanted to see if he could lead them to the truth and have them still be too blind to see him standing right in front of them. He was a master of the double bluff, a man who believed his own lies so thoroughly that they became a secondary reality. He didn't want to get away with it as much as he wanted to be seen getting away with it. He was playing detective with the lives of the dead. He was auditioning for his own legend, and the police were his captive audience. He even offered to help the Watt family's legal team find the real killer for a fee. Blood money on top of blood money. He was monetizing the grief he had manufactured. He was the first to realize that in the modern age, notoriety is a currency just as valuable as gold. He was a pioneer of the true crime industrial complex, 60 years before the rest of us. He was a meta-killer, Josie. A man who murdered the reality of the case alongside the victims.
It's like he was writing his own myth in real time. He wanted to be the smartest person in the room, especially if that room was a police station. But the ego always trips them up, doesn't it? The smartest man in Glasgow eventually does something stupid. Then the Smart family murders happened. The Smarts of Uddingston. Peter, Doris, and their 12-year-old son, Michael. All shot in their beds on New Year's Day. That's the part that hits me, Hogmanay. It's the one night of the year when Scotland feels most like a community, and he turned it into a slaughterhouse. That's when the story finally broke for him, right? That's when the beast became a man in handcuffs. When he stopped being a shadow and started being a suspect with a paper trail. He broke the sanctity of the new year, and that's a sin Glasgow couldn't forgive. He violated the first footing, Richard. He turned the celebration into a funeral. He walked into a home where he was supposed to bring luck, and he brought a revolver. He took the Auld Lang Syne spirit and strangled it.
The Smart family murders were the crack in the dam. The sheer senselessness of it. An entire family wiped out in a quiet suburb, stripped away the police's ability to ignore the patterns. But even then, it wasn't brilliant detective work that caught him. It was greed, or perhaps a different kind of narcissism. Manuel was a man of expensive tastes and no steady income. He used banknotes he'd stolen from the Smart House, specific, traceable notes, to buy rounds of drinks in Glasgow pubs during the Hogmanay celebrations. He was playing the big man, the generous spender, desperate for the validation of strangers who didn't know he was a ghost. He was literally buying friends with blood money. He was seen flashing large amounts of cash, buying whiskey for people he didn't know, basking in the artificial warmth of a busy bar. He wanted to be the king of the pub, even if the crown was made of stolen paper. He was buying a moment of relevance at the cost of 3 lives. He was handing out 10-pound notes like they were flyers for a circus where he was the star attraction. The beast was undone by a 10-pound note and a barman's memory. When the police finally raided his parents' house, they found the stolen goods tucked away like trophies. Watches, cameras, things he didn't need but couldn't bear to throw away. He was a hoarder of lives and a hoarder of trinkets. He kept the shoes of one victim and the camera of another. He was a curator of his own depravity. It's remarkably mundane when you strip away the leather-bound legends. He wasn't a genius. He was just lucky until his need for an audience outweighed his survival instinct. He forgot that even the best actor eventually has to step out of character to collect the box office receipts. He was a man who wanted to be a legend, but couldn't resist the urge to show off his wallet. He traded his life for a moment of pub-side adoration. He was a small man with a very large shadow. The tragedy is that the spotlight only found him once the stage was already covered in blood. He was a star only in the sense that a supernova is a star. Bright, but only at the moment of total destruction. He was finally the protagonist, but only in his own downfall.
And the ending? The trial? I've seen the photos of him. He looks so smug, even when he's defending himself. He looks like he's enjoying the attention, like the courtroom was just another stage for his performance. He seems to be reveling in the fact that everyone is finally looking at him. No more hiding in the shadows. He was the main event. He even tried to turn it into a debate on Scots law, arguing about the validity of his confessions with a chillingly calm demeanour. It's terrifying how comfortable he looked in the dock, like he was holding a seminar on his own depravity.
Oh, he was his own counsel for a significant portion of it. A narcissist to the very end. He dismissed his legal team and turned the High Court of Glasgow into a theatre. He cross-examined the police with the precision of a trained advocate, challenged the forensic evidence, and maintained a veneer of calm superiority. He used what we call the special defense. He actually lodged 3 of them. Most infamously, he tried to incriminate his own father, Samuel Manuel, for some of the crimes. Imagine that, Josie. To save his own neck, he was willing to throw his own father to the gallows. He stood there in court and suggested his own flesh and blood was the killer, exploiting his father's previous criminal record for housebreaking. He tried to build a ladder out of his own family's corpses to escape the rope. It was a masterclass in manipulation, but it backfired because even that era of Glasgow had limits on what it could stomach. The jury didn't see a brilliant legal mind. They saw a man without a soul. He was trying to prove he was too clever to be caught, while the prosecution was simply proving he was too evil to be free. But even in defeat, he remained performative. He even led the police to Isabel Cook's body while the trial was ongoing, almost as if he was bored of the game and wanted to show off his work. He took them to the field in High Blantyre, pointed to the ground and said, "I think you'll find her here." It was a final act of control. He decided when the search ended. He robbed them of the satisfaction of finding her themselves. Even in chains, he wanted to be the one holding the map. He wanted the last word. He was the architect of the search, even when he was the object of it. He wanted to be the one to give the families closure, but only on his terms. He was a puppeteer who kept pulling strings even after the stage had been burned down. He was more afraid of being forgotten than he was of being executed. He died as he lived, trying to own the room. He was the star of a tragedy that he himself had choreographed. He wanted to be the hero of the horror he created. Even in his cell at Barlinnie, he was reportedly correcting the grammar in the newspapers reporting on him. He requested a tailored suit for his execution. He wanted to look the part of the big man until the very last second. He was a man who understood that history is written by the one who speaks the loudest, even from the gallows. He was the ultimate academic study in primary psychopathy, a mind that experienced the world without the burden of a single second of guilt. He was a machine with a human face, a machine that was finally dismantled on a July morning in 1958.
He was one of the last men hanged at Barlinnie. The end of an era, I suppose. There's something final about that. The last of the old world hangings for a man who seemed so modern in his cruelty. He feels like a precursor to the serial killers we see in the States decades later. A man without a clear social motive, just a void where empathy should be. He didn't kill for a cause or for passion. He killed because he could. He was the end of the line for the Victorian gallows and the start of the modern sociopath. He's the bridge between the Ripper myths and the clinical killers of the late 20th century. He was our first look at a hollow man. A man who understood the value of life only in how much attention its removal could garner him. He was the man of the crowd, but the crowd was horrified. He was a 19th century ending for a 20th century ghost. He was the ghost of a future we weren't ready to face. A future where violence wasn't a means to an end, but the end itself.
July 11th, 1958. Harry Allen was the executioner. Manuel went to the gallows with a joke on his lips, or so the story goes. Something about the drop being a bit of a shock. But don't let the drama distract you, Josie. The real history isn't in his final words or the macabre details of the executioner's rope. It's in the folders of the families he destroyed, and the fact that, for 2 years, a man with a documented history of violence was allowed to walk through the rain, just like this, while the law looked for a ghost instead of a neighbor. They were searching for a monster from a storybook, but the real threat was just a man with a grudge and a gun, living in a suburban semi-detached. He was the product of a system that didn't know how to handle a man who didn't care about the rules of decent crime. He was the exception that proved the rule of post-war stability was a fragile illusion. He was the static in the radio broadcast of a perfect decade. The archives tell us he was caught, but they don't tell us how many other neighbors were walking the streets while they focused on him. They don't tell us about the silence that followed the hanging, the way the community tried to forget the name while still feeling the fear every time the wind rattled the window pane. It took years for Lanarkshire to stop looking over its shoulder. The state executed the man, but it couldn't execute the trauma he left behind. The silence in Birkenshaw after the trial was louder than the crime. It was a silence born of collective shame. Shame that they let it go on so long. It was the sound of a society realizing its own vulnerability. It was the moment the good old days died. They were buried with him in that unmarked pit. They were the casualties of a man who realized that civility is just a thin veneer, a stage curtain he could draw aside whenever he pleased. The archives are just the script for a play that keeps repeating, with a different cast and the same tragic ending. We keep looking for horns, Josie, when we should be looking for a very nice suit. We keep looking for the beast when we should be looking at the mirror. We want to believe evil is an exception, but Manuel proved it's often just a resident. He was the first to show us that the real nightmare isn't the one that breaks down your door. It's the one you invite in for a cup of sugar.
It makes me wonder about the social climate then. Post-war Scotland, everyone trying to be respectable, trying to move into those new housing estates like the ones in Uddingston or East Kilbride. These new towns were supposed to be the future. Clean, safe, orderly. They were the architectural equivalent of a clean slate, a way to escape the slums and the grime of the industrial past. They built these houses with wide windows and low fences to show they had nothing to hide. They wanted a world where the sun always shone on the lino floors. Manuel was like the rot in the floorboards of that new respectability. He proved that no matter how many new suburbs you build, you can't build a wall high enough to keep out the void in some people. He was the intruder in the garden of the middle class. He showed that progress is no defense against a predator. He was the reminder that you can move to the country, but you take the darkness with you.
Precisely. He was the shadow cast by the very institutions meant to protect us. The 1950s were a time of polite society, where the idea of a random, motiveless killer was almost impossible to process. Crime was supposed to have a why: poverty, jealousy, gang territory. It was supposed to be a transaction, even if it was a violent one. The police were equipped to handle drunken brawls, industrial accidents, and organized theft, but they weren't ready for a man who killed for the sheer high of the control. Our archives are full of these gaps, moments where society's refusal to believe in human depravity allows that depravity to flourish. We prefer the beast because it suggests he was an anomaly, a freak occurrence that can't happen again. The truth is, he was an inevitability in a system that prioritized order over observation. He was a man who understood our rules well enough to know exactly how to break them without being noticed. He was the dark side of the post-war boom. He was the Americanized ghost in the Scottish machine. He was the first modern predator in a traditional landscape. He was a man who knew the value of a clean shirt and a steady gaze. He was the wolf who learned to speak the language of the sheep perfectly. He didn't just break the law, he exploited the law's belief in its own effectiveness. He turned our own civility against us. He used our manners as his camouflage. He knew that if you act like you belong, nobody asks why you're there.
A neighbour. That's much scarier than a beast. You can prepare for a beast, but you open the door for a neighbour. You lend a neighbour a cup of sugar or a light for a cigarette. It makes you realise how thin the walls of our civilised world really are. If someone decides they don't care about the consequences, and the police are too busy looking for types to see the person right in front of them, what's actually stopping them? We like to think we're safe because of the social contract, but Manuel didn't sign it. He didn't even acknowledge it existed.
Very little, usually. Just the hope that people like Manuel are outliers. But history tells us they are more common than the archives like to admit. They are the friction points where the system grinds to a halt. We build these myths of beasts to feel safe, as if evil is something we can recognize by its horns or its growl. But Manuel was just a man who knew how to exploit the blind spots of a society that didn't want to admit someone like him could exist in their midst. He was the dark side of the post-war dream, the intruder in the new, quiet housing estates that were supposed to be the pinnacle of Scottish progress. He proved that you can build new walls, but you can't build new people. He was the ghost in the machine of 1950s prosperity.
One last thing, Richard. Do you think he'd be caught faster today? With the cameras on every corner, the DNA profiling, the digital footprint we all leave? Or would someone like him just find new blind spots to hide in?
Science makes the how easier to solve, Josie. We have the data to pin a man to a location with terrifying precision now. We have the where and the when down to the millisecond. But the why, and the institutional blindness that lets a man like Manuel play the system, that's a much older, much more stubborn problem. Data doesn't replace discernment. Even today, the most dangerous people are often the ones we've already met, already filed away, and already dismissed because they were too useful or too normal to be a monster. We have more light now, certainly, but shadows just get sharper when the light gets brighter. They don't disappear. They just wait for the light to blink. They wait for us to stop looking. And we always stop looking eventually. It's the human condition. We are hardwired to seek comfort over vigilance.
So the question isn't whether we can catch a monster. It's whether we're willing to admit the monster is sitting in the corner of a coffee shop, waiting for the rain to stop.
Precisely. Now, shall we talk about the vampire of the Gorbals? Or have you had your fill of blood for today? The archives never sleep, Josie. They just wait for someone curious enough to turn the page.
I think I've got room for one more chapter. As long as it's the messy truth, Richard.
Then let's go back to 1954, to the ironworks at midnight, where the shadows weren't just shadows, and the fog tasted of copper and iron.
Thanks for listening to our podcast.
Have a good day!
Bye!